Late April 1818, on the grounds of the Ashworth estate in Derbyshire, the greenhouse stood like a jewel box of glass and iron against the gathering dusk, its panes fogged with the breath of exotic blooms that had no business thriving in the chill English spring. Inside, Eleanor Thornhill moved between the raised beds and terracotta pots with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself small, her practical grey wool dress already dampened at the hem from the humid air that clung to everything in this verdant sanctuary. She was 32 years old, a widow for 3 of those years, and for the past 6 months she had served as greenhouse-keeper to a duke she had never met, a man perpetually abroad while she tended his collection of botanical curiosities in blessed solitude. The position had been a mercy she dared not question, secured through a distant cousin who pitied her enough to write a letter of introduction, but not enough to receive her in polite company. Society had rendered its verdict on Eleanor Thornhill long before her husband's death, and widowhood had merely sealed what her lack of beauty, lack of fortune, and the unfortunate accident that had left her, left hand scarred and stiff, had already determined. She was invisible, and she had learned to prefer it that way. Here among the jasmine that cascaded from hanging baskets and the strange orchids that required such precise attention, she found a purpose that asked nothing of her but knowledge and care. The evening light filtered through the glass in shades of amber and pearl, catching on the moisture that beaded on broad leaves and painted the air itself with living colour. Eleanor paused beside the largest of the orchids, a temperamental specimen from some distant corner of the empire, and allowed herself the smallest smile as she noted the new growth pushing from its base. This at least she could nurture. This at least would not turn away from her damaged hand, or her plain face, or the whispers that followed her like smoke. She adjusted the copper watering can, feeling the familiar ache in her left palm where the scars pulled tight, and breathed in the thick perfume of jasmine that always grew more intense as night approached. Through the fogged glass she could see the great house beyond, its windows beginning to glow with candlelight, and she felt the familiar resignation settle over her like a shawl. Somewhere in those elegant rooms, life continued in patterns she would never again be part of. But here in her glass kingdom, she had found something better than acceptance. She had found peace. Or so she told herself as she turned back to her work, unaware that the Duke of Ashworth had returned home that very afternoon, and that even now he stood in the shadow of the greenhouse entrance, watching her with an expression of unexpected curiosity. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat when she heard the door latch click, the sound cutting through the humid silence of the greenhouse, like a blade, and she turned with her damaged hand still resting on the orchid's glossy leaves to find a man standing just inside the entrance, his tall frame silhouetted against the deepening twilight beyond the fogged glass. For a moment neither of them moved, and in that suspended breath Eleanor felt the old familiar panic rise in her chest, the instinctive urge to apologize for her presence, for existing in a space where she might be seen, but something in his stillness kept her frozen in place. He was perhaps 38, though the shadows made it difficult to be certain, dressed in a dark evening coat that spoke of travel and haste rather than formal dinner, and his eyes, she realized with a start, were fixed not on her face, but on her hand where it rested against the plant. "Your Grace?" she managed, the words emerging more steady than she felt, and she withdrew her hand quickly, tucking it against her grey skirt in a gesture that had become unconscious over the years. The Duke of Ashworth stepped further into the greenhouse, and the light from the lantern she had hung near the door caught his features properly now, revealing a face that was handsome in a severe sort of way, all sharp angles and intelligent eyes that continued to track her movements with an attention that made her skin prickle with awareness. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, and his voice was deeper than she had expected, roughened perhaps by years abroad in climates less forgiving than England's perpetual damp. I arrived this afternoon and was told I had acquired a greenhouse keeper in my absence. She felt her spine straighten despite herself, some stubborn core of pride asserting itself, even as she catalogued all the ways this encounter could end in her dismissal. "I hope my work has been satisfactory, Your Grace," she replied, and gestured with her right hand toward the thriving specimens that surrounded them. "The collection has been maintained according to the instructions left by your previous keeper." He moved closer, his boots silent on the brick floor, and Eleanor forced herself not to retreat, even as he approached the orchid she had been tending. "This one was dying when I left," he observed, and there was something in his tone that was not quite a question, but invited response nonetheless. It required adjustment to the watering schedule and relocation to this bench where the afternoon light is less direct, Eleanor heard herself say, her voice taking on the quiet confidence that only ever emerged when she spoke of her work. The roots had begun to rot from excessive moisture. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Eleanor felt the full weight of his attention like a physical thing, his gaze moving from her face to her hands and back again, with a consideration that was entirely unlike the dismissive glances she had grown accustomed to from those rare members of society who noticed her at all. "You have saved it," he said simply. And something in those words, in the directness of his acknowledgement, struck her as more dangerous than any disapproval could have been. Beyond the glass, the last of the daylight faded into true night, and Eleanor became acutely aware that they stood alone in this humid sanctuary, that her hair had begun to escape its pins in the moisture, that he showed no inclination to leave, and that for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone was looking at her work, at her, and seeing something worth his continued attention. The morning of May the 1st arrived with that peculiar brightness that follows rain, the kind of light that makes everything appear washed clean and unnervingly exposed. And Eleanor woke in her small cottage at the edge of the estate grounds, with her heart already racing in her chest, convinced that the previous evening's encounter could only result in her dismissal. She had lain awake for hours after returning from the greenhouse, replaying every word, every moment when she had perhaps overstepped the bounds of her position, and by the time pale dawn crept through her window, she had nearly persuaded herself to pack her few belongings before the inevitable summons came. But the morning brought no message from the great house, and by 10 o'clock, Eleanor found herself back in the greenhouse with trembling hands, tending to the spring bulbs that were pushing through the soil in their terracotta pots, their green shoots a reminder that growth continued regardless of human anxiety. She had just finished adjusting the shading on the eastern windows when she heard voices approaching along the gravel path, and through the glass she recognized Mrs. Blake, the head housekeeper, walking with a younger maid whose name Eleanor could never remember. They stopped just outside the greenhouse door, close enough that their voices carried clearly through the slightly open ventilation panel, and Eleanor froze with her scarred hand still resting on the window latch. "His Grace was asking about her this morning," Mrs. Blake was saying, her tone carrying that particular quality of relish that comes with possessing information others want. "Wanted to know everything. He did. How long she had been here, who had recommended her, what her circumstances were." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and she found herself unable to move, trapped between the desire to flee and the terrible need to hear what would be said about her. "And what did you tell him?" the younger maid asked, her voice bright with curiosity. Mrs. Blake sighed in a way that suggested she was preparing to impart wisdom born of long experience in the management of difficult truths. "I told him what anyone in the county could tell him, that she is Eleanor Thornhill, widow of James Thornhill, who drank himself into an early grave and left her with nothing but debts and a reputation in tatters. That she had been considered unmarriageable even before that unfortunate match, plain as she is, and that accident with her hand." That society would have nothing to do with her after the scandal of her husband's gambling, and that she has been living on the charity of distant relations who were glad enough to see her settled here, where she would not embarrass them. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach, though none of this was news to her. Hearing it spoken aloud in such matter-of-fact tones somehow made it more real, more inescapable. "And what did His Grace say to all that?" the maid pressed. Mrs. Blake's voice softened slightly, taking on a note of something that might have been approval. He said that he cared nothing for society's opinions, that the greenhouse had never been better maintained, and that Mrs. Thornhill's position here was entirely secure. Then he asked which cottage was hers. Eleanor stood perfectly still in her grey dress among the emerging green shoots. Her damaged hand pressed against her chest, where her heart beat with a confusion of fear and something she dared not name, while beyond the fogged glass the voices moved away, and the bright morning light illuminated every corner of her glass sanctuary with unforgiving clarity. 3 days passed in a peculiar state of suspension, during which Eleanor moved through her work with a heightened awareness that transformed every moment in the greenhouse into something both ordinary and charged with possibility. And on the afternoon of May the 4th, she was tending to the citrus trees in their large wooden boxes when she heard his footsteps on the gravel path and felt her scarred hand begin to tremble against the watering can she held. "Your Grace," she said as he entered, and she was grateful that her voice emerged steady, even as her pulse quickened in a way that felt both dangerous and impossible to control. "Mrs. Thornhill," he replied, moving into the humid warmth with an ease that suggested he had every right to be there, which of course he did, this being his greenhouse, his estate, his entire world in which she was merely a temporarily tolerated presence. "I have been reviewing the plans for the South Garden renovation," he continued, and he withdrew a rolled set of drawings from beneath his arm, spreading them across the wooden potting bench with hands that moved with confident precision. "I find myself uncertain about several of the proposed arrangements, and wondered if you might offer your perspective." Eleanor set down the watering can carefully, wiping her palms against her grey skirt in a gesture born more of nerves than necessity, and moved closer to examine the drawings, even as every instinct told her that this request was somehow unprecedented. The Dukes did not seek the opinions of widowed greenhouse keepers on matters of estate planning. The sketches showed elaborate beds and walkways, plantings that would require years of careful maintenance, and she felt her professional interest override her anxiety as she studied the configurations. "This section here," she said, pointing with her right hand to avoid, showing him the damaged left. The proposed placement of the roses would leave them competing for light with the established oaks, and they will suffer for it. He leaned closer to see where she indicated, and Eleanor became intensely aware of his proximity, of the way his shoulder nearly brushed hers, of the scent of sandalwood, and something else she could not name that seemed to belong to him alone. "What would you suggest instead?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that made the question feel like more than a simple inquiry about horticulture. She forced her attention back to the drawings, trying to ignore the way her hand trembled slightly as she traced an alternative pattern with her finger. Here, along this southern wall, where they would receive full morning light and protection from the north wind, and perhaps clematis trained along the wall behind them to create depth without competition for resources. The citrus trees behind them were beginning to open their waxy white flowers, filling the greenhouse with a sweetness that seemed almost excessive in its intensity. And when Alexander turned his head to look at her rather than the plans, Eleanor found she could not quite meet his eyes, could not quite bear the weight of whatever she saw there that looked remarkably like genuine interest, like respect, like something she had taught herself years ago to stop hoping anyone would direct toward her plain, scarred, socially ruined self. A full week passed before Eleanor saw Alexander again, and by the evening of May 11th, she had nearly convinced herself that their conversation about garden designs had been nothing more than a momentary courtesy, that his interest in her opinions had been merely the impulse of a bored aristocrat seeking diversion, and she had just finished banking the heating stoves for the night when she heard his footsteps approaching through the gathering dusk, and felt her heart perform that now familiar leap that she despised herself for experiencing. "Mrs. Thornhill," he said as he entered, and there was something different in his bearing tonight, an energy that suggested purpose rather than casual visit. And Eleanor turned from the stove with soil still darkening her grey skirts and her damaged hand instinctively moving to tuck behind her back. "Your Grace," she replied, and wondered if he could hear the breathlessness in her voice, the way his unexpected presence seemed to alter the very air in the greenhouse until even the familiar scent of jasmine felt almost overwhelming in its sweetness. "I have brought you something," he said without preamble, and from his coat pocket he withdrew a small pouch of deep blue silk that caught the lamplight as he held it out toward her, and Eleanor found herself staring at the offered gift with a confusion of emotions she could not begin to untangle. She made no move to take it, her scarred hand remaining hidden while her right hand stayed at her side, and she could feel the weight of propriety pressing down upon her like the humid air before a storm. "Your Grace, I cannot accept gifts," she said quietly, and the words tasted like ash even as she spoke them, even as some part of her desperately wanted to reach out and take whatever he offered, to allow herself to believe that this impossible attention might mean something beyond charity or passing fancy. Alexander did not withdraw his hand, but instead took a step closer, and Eleanor became acutely aware that beyond the fogged glass the evening was darkening toward night, that they were alone here as they had been that first night, that the rules she was invoking to protect herself were perhaps already broken beyond repair. "These are seeds," he said, and his voice carried a gentleness that somehow made everything worse, made the defenses she had built around her heart feel suddenly fragile as greenhouse glass. "Seeds I collected during my travels in the East, varieties I have never seen cultivated in England. And I thought—" He paused, and Eleanor forced herself to meet his eyes, even though doing so felt dangerously like falling. "I thought that if anyone could coax them to grow in our climate, in our soil, it would be you." The emphasis he placed on our created an intimacy that terrified her, that suggested a shared future, a partnership that extended beyond the merely professional, and Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, because no one, not in all her 32 years, had ever looked at her the way Alexander Pembroke looked at her now, as though she possessed value beyond her usefulness, as though her skill mattered, as though she herself mattered. In the distance beyond the glass, she could hear the first rumble of thunder, could smell through the ventilation panels that particular electric quality that preceded rain. And when Alexander reached forward and gently took her reluctant right hand to press the silk pouch into her palm, Eleanor did not pull away, even as she knew she should, even as the storm gathered itself in the darkness, and prepared to break over the estate with all the inevitability of everything she had been trying so desperately not to hope for. The storm broke with startling violence, not 10 minutes after Eleanor had accepted the silk pouch of seeds, and the first sheets of rain hammered against the greenhouse glass with such force that she instinctively stepped back from the nearest panes, as though the barrier between shelter and tempest might somehow prove insufficient to protect them, and Alexander moved closer in what might have been either protection or simply the instinct to seek companionship in the face of nature's fury. And Eleanor found that her hand still clutched the blue silk pouch as though it were something precious beyond measure. Which perhaps it was, though not for the monetary value of exotic seeds, but for what the giving represented, for the possibility it suggested that she might be seen as more than a serviceable pair of hands tending, plants that more suitable women would later admire. "Your Grace, you should return to the house before the paths become impassable," she said, though even as the words left her lips, she felt the hollowness of them, felt the way some part of her desperately wanted him to stay here in this glass sanctuary, while the world outside dissolved into water and darkness. And Alexander shook his head with a slight smile that suggested he understood exactly what she had not said beneath what she had. "I think that opportunity has already passed," he replied, gesturing toward the windows now completely obscured by torrents that turned the glass into running rivers. "And it is no matter. I have been trapped in far worse places than a greenhouse in the company of far less interesting companions," and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the compliment, even as she told herself not to read too much into words that a duke might offer to anyone, that charm was perhaps simply his natural mode of interaction with the world. She moved to check the ventilation panels, ensuring they were sealed against the driving rain, and busied herself with adjusting the lamps to compensate for the premature darkness the storm had brought, and she was aware of Alexander watching her move through these familiar tasks with an attention that felt almost tangible, as though his gaze carried weight and warmth that touched her even across the humid space between them. The thunder came closer, shaking the glass in its frames, and Eleanor found herself drawn back toward the center of the greenhouse, where Alexander stood among the potted citrus trees with their white flowers glowing pale in the lamplight. And perhaps it was the intimacy enforced by the storm, or perhaps it was simply that her defenses had been eroding steadily since that first night he had found her here. But when he asked quietly how long she had been widowed, she found herself answering with a truth she had told no one in this place. 3 years, she said, and her voice emerged smaller than she intended. But it feels both longer and shorter than that, as though grief has a way of distorting time until you cannot quite remember if the life you had before was real or something you imagined in a dream you have since forgotten. She had not meant to say so much, had not meant to reveal the philosophical turn her solitary evenings had given her thoughts. But Alexander nodded as though he understood exactly what she meant. And he said softly that he had lost his father 2 years past, and still sometimes turned to speak to him before remembering. And in that shared acknowledgement of loss, something shifted between them. Some barrier dissolved like the rain dissolving the clear glass into running opacity. And when Eleanor felt the tears begin to slip down her cheeks, when she heard herself saying the words she had locked away for 3 years about the child she had carried for 7 months before losing both baby and husband to the fever that had swept through their village, Alexander closed the distance between them and pulled her against his chest with a gentleness that broke something in her that had been holding rigid and brittle for far too long, and she wept against his coat while his hand stroked her hair and the rain continued its relentless drumming against the glass that sheltered them from everything except the truth of their own hearts. And on her left hand she felt the cold metal of her wedding ring pressing against her palm as she clutched at his lapels, felt the weight of loyalty to a dead past warring with the dangerous living present of this man's arms around her and his breath warm against her temple. And when she finally pulled back and looked up into his face, she saw something there that looked remarkably like tenderness, like understanding, like the beginning of something that terrified her precisely because she wanted it so desperately. And the moment stretched taut between them with the storm raging outside and the scent of jasmine almost suffocating in its sweetness, and his hand still resting against her cheek where he had wiped away her tears. And Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that everything was about to change in ways she could neither prevent nor fully predict, and the knowledge felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in darkness, unsure whether the next step would be falling or flying. Eleanor woke the morning of May 15th with shame burning in her chest like banked coals. the memory of the previous evening playing in her mind with excruciating clarity. How she had wept against Alexander's coat. How she had allowed him to hold her as though she had any right to such comfort. How she had looked up into his face with her heart naked and vulnerable in her eyes. And she had risen before dawn to lose herself in work, pruning and watering with hands that trembled slightly whenever she remembered the warmth of his arms around her, the tenderness in his voice when he had spoken of his own grief, and she was elbow-deep in repotting a temperamental fern when Mrs. Blake appeared at the greenhouse door with news that His Grace was entertaining visitors and wished for a tour of the gardens. And Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, to claim work that could not be interrupted, but the housekeeper's expression made clear this was not a request, but a summons. And so Eleanor found herself washing her hands and smoothing her grey dress and tucking away the few strands of hair that had escaped her severe bun. And when she emerged into the brilliant morning sunshine, she found Alexander standing near the rose garden with 3 ladies dressed in fashionable walking gowns of sprigged muslin, their parasols like bright flowers against the green lawn. And even from a distance, Eleanor could identify Lady Caroline Hastings by the particular tilt of her chin that spoke of both beauty and the absolute certainty of her own importance. Eleanor approached with reluctance heavy in her limbs, her damaged left hand tucked, as always, slightly behind her back, and she kept her eyes lowered in the manner expected of servants, until Alexander said with unmistakable warmth in his voice, "Ah, Mrs. Thornhill, I was hoping you might join us. These ladies have expressed interest in the new plantings, and I told them that no one knows the gardens better than you," and Eleanor felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes assessing her with the particular thoroughness that fashionable women applied to those they considered beneath their notice, cataloguing her plain dress, her work-roughened hands, her complete lack of beauty or grace. And she curtsied slightly and murmured that she would be happy to show them the gardens, though happiness was perhaps the furthest thing from what she felt, as Lady Caroline smiled with lips that did not reach her eyes, and said in a voice like honey poured over glass, "How delightful that His Grace takes such interest in the staff. It speaks so well of his character, does it not? Though one must be careful that kindness is not mistaken for anything more particular." The barb landed with precision, and Eleanor felt the colour rise in her cheeks, even as she forced herself to remain composed, to lead them along the paths she had helped design, pointing out the varieties of roses that would bloom throughout the summer, the careful placement of perennials to ensure continuous colour, and she was acutely aware of Alexander walking beside her, closer than necessary, asking her opinion on various plantings with a deference that made Lady Caroline's smile grow increasingly brittle. And when they reached the greenhouse, and Eleanor explained the system she had developed for propagating the exotic specimens, Alexander looked at her with such obvious admiration that Lady Caroline actually laughed, a sound like breaking crystal, and said with exquisite cruelty disguised as jest, "My dear Duke, you speak to your gardener as though she were a botanist presenting to the Royal Society," and Eleanor felt the words strike like a physical blow, felt the familiar weight of her place in the world settling back onto her shoulders like chains, and she saw something flash in Alexander's eyes that might have been anger before he said with perfect courtesy and unmistakable steel beneath the words, "Mrs. Thornhill possesses more knowledge of horticulture than most men who claim that title, and I consider myself fortunate to have her expertise at my disposal." And the emphasis he placed on expertise created a sudden tension that hung in the air like humidity before a storm. And Eleanor realized with dawning horror that his defense of her, his obvious regard, would only make everything infinitely worse once these women returned to their drawing rooms and began to talk. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. 2 days passed, during which Eleanor kept to the greenhouse and its adjoining cottage, with the determination of someone who understood that visibility meant vulnerability, and she told herself that the flush of shame burning perpetually in her chest would fade if she simply avoided the main house and its inhabitants, and especially avoided any possibility of encountering Alexander Pembroke, whose kindness had become more dangerous than any cruelty because it made her hope for things that could never be. And she was working among the propagation tables on the afternoon of May 17th when she heard voices drifting through the open door of the potting shed, the particular cadence of servants speaking freely because they believed themselves unobserved, and some instinct made Eleanor freeze with her hands buried in soil and her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the voice of Mary, one of the upstairs maids, saying with barely suppressed laughter that Lady Caroline had told Mrs. Henderson, who had told Cook, that the Duke had clearly been too long abroad if he thought a widow with a crippled hand and a face like a Sunday sermon made appropriate company for a man of his station. Eleanor felt the words strike like blows, each one landing with precision against the tender places she had spent 3 years learning to protect. And another voice, belonging to the scullery maid whose name Eleanor could not recall, added with the cruelty of youth that perhaps his Grace simply pitied Mrs. Thornhill, and did not realize how his charity would be interpreted, how people were already saying he must be peculiar in his tastes if he spent so much time with a woman who looked as though she had been assembled from spare parts, and none of them the good ones, and the laughter that followed was bright and careless as breaking glass. And Eleanor stood perfectly still in the potting shed, with her hands beginning to shake, and soil falling between her fingers like the remnants of foolish dreams crumbling back to earth. She waited until the voices faded before she moved, before she allowed herself to breathe again, and then she walked with careful dignity back to her cottage, where she pulled her single trunk from beneath the bed and began to fold the few dresses she owned, with hands that trembled so violently she had to stop twice to simply press her palms against her thighs and will herself to steadiness. And she told herself this was inevitable, that she had known from the beginning that a man like Alexander Pembroke could never see a woman like her as anything more than an object of passing interest or temporary pity, that his kindness had been exactly what the servants suggested, charity mistaken by her desperate, lonely heart for something warmer and more personal. By evening she had packed everything she owned and had written a resignation letter in her careful script, thanking His Grace for the opportunity to serve and explaining that family matters required her immediate departure, the lie sitting bitter on her tongue even in written form, and she sat at the small table in her cottage with the letter sealed and her trunk packed and the last light fading from the windows, and she allowed herself one moment of grief for the life she had begun to imagine here among the plants that had become her companions, and the man whose attention had made her feel for the first time in years as though she might be something more than the sum of society's dismissals. And then she pressed her scarred left hand against her mouth to muffle the sound of her weeping, and told herself that by morning she would be gone before anyone could witness the final humiliation of her departure, before Alexander could offer more of the pity that everyone apparently saw so clearly in his regard for her, before she had to endure the knowing looks of servants who understood what she had been too foolish to accept, that some barriers could not be crossed, no matter how gently a duke might speak about horticulture, or how tenderly he might wipe away tears during a storm. Eleanor had intended to slip away before dawn, like a ghost departing a house it had haunted briefly and without consequence. But the universe, or fate, or perhaps simply her own exhausted grief, had conspired against her, and she had fallen asleep in the chair beside her packed trunk, still wearing her grey dress, with her resignation letter clutched in her scarred left hand. And when she woke with a start, it was to find the evening settling thick and golden through the cottage windows, and the sound of footsteps approaching with the particular confident rhythm that she had learned to recognize over these past weeks. and she had barely enough time to stand and smooth her wrinkled skirts before Alexander appeared in the doorway of her cottage without knocking. His face flushed, as though he had been searching for some time, his dark coat discarded somewhere, and his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows in a state of disarray she had never seen him permit before, and his eyes went immediately to the trunk and then to the letter in her hand. And something in his expression shifted from concern to what looked remarkably like fury, as he said with barely controlled intensity, "Tell me this is not what it appears to be." Eleanor felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack under the weight of his regard, under the accusation in his voice that suggested she was doing something to him rather than protecting them both from the consequences of his misplaced kindness. And she lifted her chin and said with as much dignity as she could summon that she was grateful for the opportunity to serve, but that it was time for her to seek a position elsewhere. And the words sounded hollow even to her own ears, the lie transparent as greenhouse glass. And Alexander took 3 steps into the cottage, and suddenly the small space felt impossibly intimate, charged with an electricity that made the air itself seem to vibrate. And he said in a voice rough with emotion, "Do not insult us both with polite fabrications, Eleanor. I know what happened, I know what you heard, and I know that you are running because society's cruelty has convinced you that my regard for you is somehow shameful or misguided." The use of her Christian name without permission or preamble struck her like a physical touch, intimate and claiming, and she felt tears begin to burn behind her eyes, even as she forced herself to say that he did not understand, that his attention to her had already caused talk, that she would not be the instrument of damage to his reputation or standing. And as she spoke, her voice began to break and betray her, and suddenly she was not speaking of reputation at all, but of the deeper truth beneath, that she could not bear to be an object of pity, could not endure knowing that when he looked at her, he saw only someone to be rescued or reformed or redeemed through the exercise of his noble charity. Alexander made a sound that might have been frustration or pain and closed the remaining distance between them. And in a gesture that scattered her words like startled birds, he reached out and took the resignation letter from her hand and tore it cleanly in half. And then again, the pieces falling to the cottage floor like snow, and he said with an intensity that made her breath catch, "You believe I pity you, that my regard is condescension dressed as kindness, but you are wrong. Eleanor, you are spectacularly and completely wrong, and I am about to prove it in a manner that will leave no room for your stubborn martyrdom or your determination to believe yourself unworthy of genuine affection." Eleanor felt the world tilt and narrow until there was nothing but the small space of her cottage, and the man standing close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the particular shade of gold that threaded through the brown of his iris. And before she could marshal another argument or erect another defensive wall, he lifted his hand and traced the line of her jaw with fingers that trembled slightly, as though he too felt the weight of this moment. This crossing of an invisible boundary that once traversed could never be uncrossed. And he said in a voice rough with emotion that what he felt for her had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with the way she spoke about soil composition as though it were poetry, the way her scarred hand moved with unconscious grace among the plants, the way she had wept for a lost child during a storm and trusted him with grief she clearly shared with no one else, the way she challenged him and questioned him, and treated him not as a duke to be deferred to, but as a man to be considered and sometimes contraded and always met as an equal. She stood frozen beneath his touch, barely breathing, feeling the careful architecture of her, resignation crumbling like sun-baked clay. And when she tried to speak, he placed his thumb gently against her lips and said that he had spent 3 years traveling the continent in search of something he could not name, surrounded by the most celebrated beauties and eligible women of a dozen cities, and he had felt nothing but a distant appreciation, as one might feel for a well-executed painting or a particularly fine piece of music, aesthetic and empty. And then he had returned to his estate and found a widow in his greenhouse at midnight, speaking to Jasmine as though the flowers could hear her. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had felt genuinely curious, genuinely engaged, genuinely awake. The words fell over Eleanor like rain, soaking through the parched soil of her self-perception, and she felt something ancient and wounded begin to unfurl in her chest, like a seed that had waited years for the right conditions to risk the vulnerability of growth. And when Alexander moved his hand from her lips to cup her face with a tenderness that made her eyes burn with tears, she did not try to pull away. And when he leaned forward with agonizing slowness, as though giving her every opportunity to refuse, she found instead that she was lifting onto her toes to close the distance between them. And then his mouth was on hers, and the cottage and the trunk and the torn resignation letter scattered on the floor all ceased to exist, and there was only the shocking intimacy of lips and breath, and the taste of him which was somehow exactly right, and his arms came around her, drawing her against the solid warmth of his body, and she felt her scarred hand rise of its own accord to press against the glass of the window behind her where condensation had begun to form in the cooling evening air, and the jasmine scent that drifted through the open door from the greenhouse was so overwhelming it seemed to Eleanor that the entire world had narrowed to this single moment of recognition and surrender and impossible, terrifying hope. Eleanor woke the next morning to find herself still dressed and lying atop the coverlet of her narrow bed, with dawn light streaming through the cottage windows in pale gold ribbons that spoke of a world transformed, and for a disoriented moment she wondered if the previous evening had been some fevered dream conjured by exhaustion and loneliness. But then she touched her lips with tentative fingers and felt them still tender from the pressure of his mouth, and knew with a certainty that settled into her bones like warmth after long cold that it had been real, that Alexander had kissed her among the jasmine with a passion that had unmade every careful boundary she had constructed around her heart. And the knowledge filled her with equal measures of joy and terror, because everything had changed, and there was no path back to the safety of invisibility and low expectations. She rose and washed her face in the basin and changed into a fresh grey dress, though her hands shook so badly that she had difficulty with the buttons, and she was attempting to pin her hair into some semblance of order when she heard the sound of a carriage arriving at the main house, the wheels crunching on gravel with an authority that suggested wealth and consequence. And through her window she could see a coach emblazoned with a crest she did not recognize, drawn by 4 matched bays, and even from this distance she could sense that its arrival meant something significant, something that would affect the fragile new reality she and Alexander had created in the intimate darkness of her cottage. She made her way to the greenhouse as she always did, seeking the comfort of familiar routines and the non-judgmental presence of her plants. But she had been there barely 20 minutes when Mrs. Blake appeared at the door with an expression that managed to combine sympathy and warning in equal measure, and the housekeeper said quietly that the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth had arrived without prior notice, and that His Grace had requested Eleanor make herself available that afternoon as there were matters to be discussed, and the careful neutrality of the phrasing could not disguise the tension beneath, and Eleanor felt her brief morning of fragile hope begin to crack like thin ice under unexpected weight. She spent the hours until the appointed meeting time moving through her tasks with mechanical precision, deadheading spent blooms and checking soil moisture and adjusting ventilation panels. But her mind was consumed with visions of Alexander regretting the previous evening, of his family demanding she be dismissed, of the inevitable correction that must come when a duke temporarily forgot himself with an employee so far beneath his station, and by the time the clock struck 2 and she made her way toward the main house with her scarred hand clenched tight against her skirt, she had nearly convinced herself that she should have left when she had the chance, that she had been a fool to believe even for a moment that jasmine-scented kisses could bridge the vast chasm between a widowed greenhouse keeper and a man whose ancestry could be traced back 6 generations of unbroken noble lineage. The drawing-room into which Eleanor was shown at precisely 2:30 was a monument to aristocratic restraint. All pale blue silk walls and furniture upholstered in cream damask with gilded legs that spoke of wealth so established it need not announce itself. And seated in the center of this refined space, like a queen holding court, was a woman who could only be the Dowager Duchess, her silver hair arranged in elaborate braids beneath a lace cap, her posture so rigidly perfect it seemed she had been carved from marble, and at her throat gleamed an emerald brooch the size of a quail egg that caught the afternoon light and threw green fire across the room. Alexander stood near the fireplace with an expression Eleanor had never seen on him before, something cold and formal that made him look suddenly like the aristocrat he was rather than the man who had kissed her, breathless among jasmine the previous evening. And when Eleanor entered and curtsied as deeply as her trembling legs would allow, she felt the weight of the dowager's gaze like a physical pressure, assessing and dismissing her in the space of 3 seconds with a thoroughness that made Eleanor feel as though her grey dress and practical boots and scarred hand had been catalogued and found comprehensively wanting. The dowager did not invite her to sit, and so Eleanor remained standing in the center of the expensive carpet, feeling like a servant called to account for some transgression. And when the older woman finally spoke, her voice was cultured and cold as winter rain, inquiring in tones of exquisite politeness exactly how long Eleanor had been employed on the estate and what her previous circumstances had been, and whether she had family of any standing who might vouch for her character, each question a delicate blade designed to cut without appearing to draw blood. Eleanor answered with as much dignity as she could summon, explaining that she had been widowed 3 years prior when her husband perished in the same fire that had damaged her hand, that she had no family remaining save a distant cousin in Yorkshire with whom she had no contact, that she had supported herself through positions in 4 different households before accepting the greenhouse keeper role 6 months ago, and she watched the dowager's expression grow progressively colder with each revelation of her unremarkable origins and lack of social connection. And when Alexander attempted to interject that Eleanor's skill with rare plants was exceptional, and that she had transformed the estate gardens, his mother silenced him with a single glance that spoke of decades of maternal authority. The interrogation continued for what felt like hours, but could not have been more than 20 minutes. Questions about Eleanor's education and whether she attended church regularly, and what precisely she imagined her future on the estate might entail. And through it all, Eleanor kept her spine straight, and her scarred hand still, and her voice level, even as she felt her brief flowering of hope being systematically pruned back to bare stems. And when the dowager finally dismissed her with instructions to return to her duties, and a pointed suggestion that she consider whether this position was truly suitable for someone of her particular circumstances, Eleanor curtsied again and walked from the room with her head high, and she did not allow herself to look at Alexander, because she knew that if she met his eyes, she would shatter like greenhouse glass struck by a stone. The 3 days that followed the dowager's interrogation passed with the peculiar slowness of time measured in heartbeats rather than hours, and Eleanor retreated into a familiar pattern of self-protection that had served her well through widowhood and poverty and the casual cruelties of a world that had no use for women without beauty or fortune or powerful connections, which is to say that she made herself invisible again, arriving at the greenhouse only after darkness had fallen, and leaving before first light touched the eastern sky, moving through her duties with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has learned that feeling, Nothing is infinitely safer than allowing hope to take root where it can only be torn out. She avoided the main house entirely, and took her meals in the cottage, and when Mrs. Blake knocked at her door with worried inquiries, Eleanor claimed a mild spring cold that made social interaction inadvisable, and the lie sat bitter on her tongue, but not so bitter as the truth would have been, which was that she could not bear to see Alexander's face, and find there either pity for her humiliation, or worse, the cool politenesses of a man who had come to his senses and realized that a moment of passion in jasmine-scented darkness was no foundation for defying the expectations of his class and family. The greenhouse at night became her sanctuary again, as it had been before he had entered it that first evening a lifetime ago in late April, and she found a melancholy comfort in the familiar rhythms of watering and pruning, and the silent company of plants that asked nothing of her but competent care, though she could not help but notice that the rare orchid they had tended together with such careful attention had finally begun to bloom, its pale petals unfurling in the candlelight like a reproach or perhaps a promise, and she touched the delicate flowers with her scarred hand and felt something crack inside her chest, because beauty like this seemed impossibly cruel when her own brief flowering had been cut back so thoroughly. On the third night she was adjusting the ventilation panels near the orchid when she heard footsteps on the gravel path outside, and her heart seized with mingled longing and dread because she knew his gait now as well as she knew her own breathing. But she did not turn when the door opened, and his voice came low and frustrated through the humid air, asking why she had been avoiding him, and whether she imagined he was so weak-willed as to be swayed by his mother's disapproval. And Eleanor kept her back to him and her eyes on the orchid, and said with a steadiness that cost her everything that she thought it best they returned to a more appropriate arrangement, that she was grateful for his previous kindness, but that she understood the realities of their respective positions, and the careful formal phrases felt like glass shards in her mouth. But she forced them out because protecting him from the scandal of association with her seemed the only gift she had left to offer, and when he crossed the space between them and turned her by the shoulders to face him, she saw in his eyes not relief, but something very much like fury. The fury in Alexander's eyes burned with such intensity that Eleanor took an involuntary step backward and felt the edge of the potting bench press against her spine, trapping her between wood, and the man whose regard she had tried so desperately to refuse for what she had convinced herself were his own protection and best interests. And his voice when he spoke was low and controlled in the way that suggested emotions held in check only through tremendous effort, as he informed her that he had not asked for her permission to care for her, and that he would be damned twice over before he allowed his mother's antiquated notions of appropriate matches to dictate whom he would or would not pursue. And Eleanor opened her mouth to protest that she was trying to spare him the scandal and social difficulty that would inevitably follow any serious attachment to a woman of her circumstances. But he continued speaking with a determination that left no space for her self-sacrificing arguments. He told her that he had spent 6 years abroad precisely because he had grown weary of the suffocating expectations of a society that valued bloodlines over character and fortune over genuine worth, that he had returned to England hoping to find something real amid all the performative artifice of ton gatherings and strategic marriage negotiations, and that discovering her in his greenhouse, tending orchids with more knowledge and care than most of the supposed experts he had encountered in 3 continents, had felt like stumbling upon water after crossing a desert. And did she truly imagine he would relinquish that discovery simply because his mother disapproved, or because Eleanor herself had decided in her infinite martyrdom that she knew better than he did what would serve his happiness? The words struck Eleanor like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because they were spoken with such raw honesty that they bypassed all her carefully constructed defenses. and she felt tears burning hot behind her eyes as he reached out and took her scarred hand in both of his and told her with devastating gentleness that he understood she had been hurt and dismissed and taught by bitter experience to expect nothing but more of the same, but that she would have to do better than noble self-sacrifice if she truly wished to be rid of him, because he had no intention of making it easy for her to run. He released her hand and stepped back, and in a voice that had shifted from passionate intensity to calm calculation, informed her that the village assembly was scheduled for May 28th, that he expected her to attend as his guest, and that if she agreed he would demonstrate in terms that left no room for misunderstanding or social ambiguity exactly what his intentions toward her were. And Eleanor stared at him, feeling the world tilt sideways because he was speaking of public declaration in a venue where half the county would witness whatever statement he chose to make. Before she could formulate a response, he was gone, leaving her alone with blooming orchids and the lingering scent of his presence, and a choice that terrified her more than any amount of solitary safety ever could. The village assembly hall on the evening of May the 28th blazed with candlelight that flickered across walls decorated with spring flowers and reflected off the jewelry adorning every woman of consequence in the county. And Eleanor stood just inside the entrance, feeling as though she had stepped onto a stage where every eye was a spotlight trained upon her inadequacies, cataloguing with merciless precision the ways in which she did not belong among women whose gowns cost more than she had earned in a year of greenhouse work, and whose confidence came from never having questioned their right to occupy beautiful spaces and demand attention. The deep blue silk she wore had been sewn in frantic haste by Mrs. Blake and the housekeeper's sister, the fabric a gift from Alexander that had arrived at her cottage 3 days prior, with a note in his bold hand stating simply that grey did not suit her and that he expected to see her in colours that matched her eyes. And though the gown fit well enough and the style was current, Eleanor could not shake the feeling that she was playing dress-up in borrowed finery, a child pretending to sophistication that would be stripped away the moment anyone looked closely enough to see the widow with scarred hands and no family name worth mentioning. She had arrived alone as Alexander had instructed, though the instruction had seemed cruel until she understood that he intended their entrance together to be witnessed by all. And now she stood near a column, trying to make herself smaller, while conversations died around her and whispers rose like smoke, and she caught fragments of speculation about the Duke's shocking condescension and poor Mrs. Thornhill's presumption, and really what could he be thinking? And the familiar shame burned hot in her chest until she remembered the fury in his eyes when she had tried to release him from obligation, and the way he had held her scarred hand as though it were something precious. The musicians were tuning their instruments, and the assembly master was announcing the first set when a ripple of attention moved through the crowd like wind across water, and Eleanor looked up to see Alexander entering through the main doors, dressed in formal black that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the aristocratic planes of his face, and on his hand catching the candlelight was a gold ring bearing his family crest that every person present would recognize as the signet passed down through 8 generations of dukes, and he was scanning the room with the focused intensity of a man on a mission, until his eyes found hers across the crowded space, and his entire expression transformed into something so tender and determined that Eleanor forgot to breathe. He crossed directly to her without pausing to acknowledge the greetings, called out by various hopeful families or the shocked expression on Lady Caroline Hastings' face, and when he reached Eleanor, he bowed with a formality that was pure theatre before extending his hand and saying, in a voice pitched to carry through the now silent hall, that he hoped she had saved the first dance for him, and Eleanor placed her scarred hand in his and felt the world shift irrevocably as he led her onto the floor. The waltz began with a single clear note from the violin, and Alexander placed his hand at Eleanor's waist with a certainty that communicated itself through silk and skin and the fragile architecture of her remaining defences. And as they moved into the opening figures, she was acutely aware that every eye in the assembly hall remained fixed upon them with an attention that was equal parts scandal and fascination, because dukes did not claim the first dance with widowed housekeepers, no matter how fine the gown or how well executed the steps. And yet here was Alexander guiding her through the movements with a skill that made her feel graceful despite her trembling, and a pride in his expression that suggested he was escorting the most accomplished woman in England rather than one whose last dance had been at a country wedding 5 years past. He held her closer than strict propriety allowed, and spoke to her in a voice pitched for her ears alone, telling her that she looked beautiful, and that the blue brought out depths in her eyes he had only glimpsed before in candlelight, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks as she managed to whisper that he was making a spectacle, and that the gossip would be merciless come morning, to which he replied with a smile that held equal parts mischief and determination that he was counting on it because ambiguity had served them poorly, and he intended to leave no doubt in any observer's mind about the nature of his regard or the seriousness of his intentions. The music swelled, and they turned through a series of rotations that brought them past Lady Caroline Hastings, whose expression had progressed from shock through outrage to a kind of calculating retreat. And Eleanor watched as the woman who had led the campaign of cruel whispers gathered her party and made for the exit, with a haste that suggested strategic withdrawal, and the sight filled Eleanor with something dangerously close to triumph, even as her rational mind warned that one public dance did not remake the social order or erase the gulf between a duke and a woman of no consequence. But Alexander seemed determined to prove her rational mind wrong, because when the waltz concluded, he did not release her or return her to the sidelines, but instead kept her hand clasped in his and led her directly to where his mother stood, in conversation with the local magistrate and his wife. And the Dowager Duchess's face when she saw them approaching was a study in aristocratic displeasure, barely contained beneath a veneer of public civility. Yet Alexander introduced Eleanor as the woman responsible for bringing his greenhouse back to its former glory, and spoke of her knowledge and skill with such warmth and respect that the magistrate's wife began asking questions about roses, and the dowager found herself forced by the rules of polite society to acknowledge Eleanor's curtsy and make small conversation. Other couples had taken the floor for the second dance, but Alexander made no move to leave Eleanor's side, and gradually others began to approach, some drawn by genuine curiosity about the woman who had captured ducal attention, and others by the social calculus that suggested aligning with his choice might prove advantageous. And Eleanor found herself swept into conversations about gardening and estate management, and even a tentative invitation to tea from a baronet's daughter who confessed to killing every plant she touched and desperately needed guidance. The afternoon of June the 2nd arrived with the kind of golden light that turned the greenhouse glass into panels of amber and honey, and Eleanor stood among the plants she had tended for the past 8 months, feeling as though she had lived several lifetimes since that first evening when she had been startled by Alexander's presence in what she had believed to be her private sanctuary. And now he had sent word through Mrs. Blake that he wished to see her here at 4 o'clock regarding a matter of some importance, and though the assembly had been 5 days past, and the world had not ended, despite her fears, Eleanor could not quite silence the voice that whispered. This was where he would explain that public support was one thing, but private commitment quite another. She had been working with the orchid they had tended together, the rare specimen that had finally bloomed into cascading white flowers marked with the faintest blush of pink. And she was adjusting its position to catch the afternoon light when she heard the greenhouse door open and turned to see Alexander entering with an expression that combined nervousness and determination in equal measure, and the sight of a duke looking uncertain made her own anxiety ease fractionally, because whatever he had come to say clearly mattered enough to strip away some of his usual confidence. He crossed to where she stood among the carefully arranged tables of plants, and for a long moment simply looked at her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of her practical work dress, and the soil under her fingernails, and the way her hair was coming loose from its pins. And then he reached out and took both her hands in his, including the scarred left one he always treated as though it were precious rather than damaged. And he said that he had been thinking about how they had begun in this space, and how appropriate it seemed to return here for what he hoped would be a new beginning. Eleanor felt her heart accelerate as he released one of her hands to reach into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that looked old and well kept, and when he opened it, she saw a ring of rose gold set with a single perfect sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that caught the greenhouse light and scattered it in blue fire, and Alexander explained that it had belonged to his grandmother, who had been, according to family legend, the only person his grandfather had ever truly loved, despite her being the daughter of a country vicar with no fortune or connections, and that his grandmother had insisted love mattered more than lineage, and had apparently been proven correct by 40 years of devoted marriage. He told Eleanor that he had known since the evening of the storm, when she had trusted him with her grief, that he wanted to spend whatever years remained to him learning the depths of her mind and heart, and that the assembly had been his way of telling society his choice was made. But this moment was for them alone, without audience or performance. And then Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Ashworth, descended to one knee on the greenhouse floor among the plants they had grown together, and asked Eleanor Thornhill if she would consent to be his wife and the Duchess of Ashworth and his partner in all things for whatever time they were granted. The morning of June 15th dawned with the kind of perfect clarity that felt like benediction, and Eleanor woke in the small cottage that had been her home for these transformative months, knowing it was the last time she would rise in this narrow bed as Eleanor Thornhill, because by evening she would be Eleanor Pembroke, Duchess of Ashworth, a title that still felt like borrowed clothing despite the ring on her finger and the 2 weeks of preparation that had transformed the estate chapel from quiet sanctuary into a space adorned with masses of white roses and the jasmine that Alexander had insisted upon, because he said the scent was inextricable from his memory of falling in love. Mrs. Blake arrived at 8 o'clock to help her dress, and the housekeeper, who had been kind when kindness was rare, moved about the cottage with an efficiency that could not quite hide the tears in her eyes as she laced Eleanor into the gown of ivory silk that had been made by the finest modiste in London, a dress that managed to be both elegant and simple, with long sleeves that covered the scars on Eleanor's left hand, and a neckline that framed the sapphire pendant Alexander had given her as a wedding gift, a match to the ring she wore. Thomas, the head gardener, brought her bouquet at 9:30, jasmine and white roses bound with ivory ribbon, and he told her gruffly that the Duke was a lucky man, and that anyone who had watched her bring the greenhouse back from neglect knew she had the kind of patient strength that would serve her well in the peculiar wilderness of aristocratic life. And Eleanor embraced him with gratitude for his steady friendship through all the uncertain weeks. The ceremony was set for 11 o'clock, and the guest list had been deliberately small, Alexander having declared that he wanted only those who genuinely wished them well, rather than the parade of social obligation a ducal wedding typically demanded, and so the chapel would hold perhaps 40 souls, including the vicar and his wife, who had known Eleanor in her first widowhood, and had never treated her as less than tully human. She walked to the chapel through the estate gardens that were now in full summer glory, and Alexander was waiting at the altar in dark blue superfine that made his eyes luminous, and the expression on his face when he saw her entering on Thomas's arm, because she had no father or brother to perform that office, was one of such unguarded joy that Eleanor felt the last of her fears dissolve like morning mist under sun. The ceremony itself passed in a kind of golden haze, the vicar's words about love and faithfulness and the joining of two souls into one partnership, resonating in the stone space while light filtered through stained glass and painted them both in colors like blessing. And when Alexander spoke his vows, his voice was steady and certain, and when Eleanor spoke hers, she marveled at her own clarity, because for the first time in years she was making a promise she believed with her whole heart she could keep. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew wearing the emerald brooch Eleanor remembered from their first difficult meeting, and though her expression remained carefully neutral, there was something in the way she inclined her head when Eleanor met her eyes that suggested, if not approval, then at least acceptance, and Eleanor understood that some victories were measured in inches rather than miles, and that was enough for this day. The afternoon of May the 20th, 1819 arrived warm and bright, and Eleanor stood in the greenhouse that had been expanded over the winter months into a structure twice its original size, with additional wings for propagation and a dedicated space for the medicinal herb garden she had proposed to Alexander last autumn, and she rested one hand on the swell of her belly, where their child grew and turned beneath her heart, while with the other she examined the orchid that had been the first thing they had tended together, and which had now been propagated into 12 healthy specimens that bloomed throughout the greenhouse in cascades of white and pink that filled the air with delicate fragrance. She had just finished instructing the 2 new apprentice gardeners Alexander had hired at her recommendation, young women from the village who showed genuine aptitude and interest and who looked at Eleanor with something approaching awe, because the Duchess of Ashworth, who still worked with her own hands among the plants and soil, was a figure unlike any other woman of rank they had encountered, and Eleanor had discovered that she took profound satisfaction in passing along the knowledge that had been her refuge in darker years, and watching it take root in minds hungry for purpose beyond what society typically offered women of their station. Alexander found her there at 3 o'clock, as he often did in the afternoons, loosening his cravat as he entered the humid warmth and crossing to where she stood to press a kiss to her temple and rest his palm over hers on the place where their child moved, and he asked how she was feeling with the combination of tenderness and slight anxiety that had characterized his manner ever since she had told him of her pregnancy 4 months past, and Eleanor reassured him, as she did daily, that she was well and strong, and that Dr. Morrison had pronounced her in excellent health at his visit yesterday. They walked together through the expanded greenhouse while Eleanor showed him the progress of the seedlings she was cultivating for the estate's tenant farmers, a project she had initiated to improve crop diversity, and which had been met with cautious interest that was gradually warming into enthusiasm as the practical benefits became apparent. And Alexander told her that he had received a letter from his mother, who was traveling in Scotland, and who had written with what could almost be interpreted as warmth to inquire after Eleanor's health and express her intention to return before the child's birth in August. Eleanor felt the familiar complex tangle of emotions that thoughts of the Dowager Duchess always provoked, because though the relationship between them could not be called affectionate, there had developed over the past year a mutual respect built on the foundation of their shared love for Alexander, and the undeniable fact that Eleanor's management of the estate gardens had brought both beauty and increased productivity that reflected well on the family name. And she had learned that some victories were indeed measured in inches, and that the Dowager's stiff approval was likely the closest thing to acceptance she would receive, and that was enough. They stood together among the jasmine that bloomed year-round now in the temperature-controlled environment Eleanor had designed, and Alexander pulled her gently against his side and told her that watching her bloom into confidence and authority over this past year had been among the greatest privileges of his life, and Eleanor leaned into his warmth and thought of the woman she had been 13 months ago, who had believed herself invisible and finished, and knew with absolute certainty that love had not merely transformed her, but had revealed what had always been present beneath the resignation and grief. Perhaps you are listening to this story in a moment when you feel unseen, when the world has decided that your best years have passed, or that circumstances have rendered you invisible. And if so, I want you to hold close the truth that Eleanor discovered in that greenhouse amid the jasmine and the carefully tended orchids, which is that transformation is not the sole province of the young or the unblemished, or those whom society has deemed worthy of attention, but rather belongs to anyone who has the courage to tend the seeds of possibility, even when the glass seems fogged and the path forward unclear. Eleanor's story reminds us that worth is not diminished by scars, whether they mark our hands or our hearts, that the qualities which make us truly valuable, patience and knowledge, and the capacity to nurture growth in difficult soil, are precisely the qualities that superficial judgment overlooks in its haste to catalogue only what can be assessed at a glance. There is profound dignity in continuing to cultivate beauty and purpose, even when no one appears to be watching, in showing up each evening to care for living things that depend on your attention, in refusing to let grief or dismissal extinguish the particular light you bring to the world. And it is often in those hidden hours of faithful tending that we develop the strength and clarity that will serve us when recognition finally arrives. The glass of the greenhouse served as both barrier and window throughout Eleanor's journey, separating her from a society that had written her off, while simultaneously allowing the right person to see clearly what others missed. And in your own life, you may find that the very circumstances that seem to isolate you are actually creating the transparency through which genuine connection becomes possible when someone with eyes to truly see finally looks your way. Love that transforms rather than diminishes sees you whole, scars and all, and refuses to accept the limitations that others have imposed, and such love is worth waiting for even through long seasons of loneliness, because it does not ask you to become smaller or hide your competence or pretend that your past did not shape you into exactly who you are. If you are 32 or 52 or 72 and you have believed the whispers that suggested your chapter of romance or reinvention has closed, let Eleanor's story stand as evidence that new growth can emerge in any season when conditions align, that the skills you have developed in obscurity have value beyond measure, that hands that have worked and grieved and endured are hands capable of building something beautiful when they finally join with hands that recognize their worth. Your greenhouse might not be made of glass and filled with jasmine. It might be an office or a craft room, or simply the interior landscape of your own resilient heart. But wherever you have continued to tend growth despite discouragement, know that you are preparing for a harvest you cannot yet imagine. Thank you for allowing me to share Eleanor and Alexander's journey with you. And if their story has touched something true in your own experience, I invite you to continue this conversation by subscribing for more tales of transformation and the enduring truth that it is never too late for new beginnings.